people are talking about girls and women, and that's because it's a really understood, under-researched area, and the people themselves are fantastic people who need support and deserve support. So today you're going to get an overview of my work as a clinician. I'm an individual, couple, and family therapist specializing in autism. And I'm going to talk about, as you'll see, why girls and women get missed and the impact of getting missed, how that affects their mental health, their sense of self, and their overall identity. So what I did before this talk was I reached out to the Asking Autistics, or the Actually Autistic community on Twitter, because they have a very, very active presence on Twitter where they're sharing information about autism and dispelling myths. So I said, I'd love your input. This is specifically for women that I reached out to. What do you wish your parents had known or done to have made your life easier? And what did your parents do that helped your well-being? So the first few slides today is just going to be feedback from these women on Twitter. I also pulled my Asper Femme group, which I run in Toronto, and we pulled the Asper Dames group, which is a new online group. And here's what they had to say. Number one, encouragement, acceptance, patience, and support. Above all else, this is what girls and women would have wanted when they were growing up. They would have wanted to know that it was okay to be who they are, to give them the space to grow without judgment, and to give them encouragement. These are all direct quotes from the women who responded. I'm going to read this one here. They could have been accepting and supportive of me instead of trying to fix me. Especially during meltdowns, they could have provided support and kindness instead of being embarrassed and ashamed of me. These are the messages that young girls and women are getting when they're growing up, that who they are is wrong and flawed and needs to be fixed. And I'm sure you can imagine what those messages would feel like. One woman did say, "Mom let me be who I am and never told me to try to be someone else." So being accepted for being different is the number one thing they wished their parents would have done differently. And I want to say that we're talking about parents here, but really we're talking about anyone involved in the child or youth's life, whether it's an educator or an extended family member or a clinician. These are the things that they wanted. Celebrate differences. What would have made the difference for me was having my difference acknowledged and loved, not acknowledged and criticized. Here's a positive thing that they found parents did. My parents never compared me to other kids and never tried to raise me according to outside standards. They figured out what would be right for me and acted accordingly. It made all the difference. So when you see the children you're working with, or perhaps your own children, who are displaying differences, it's to point it out in a positive way. Look what you can do. This is amazing. You're different than other kids. You're not less. It's very, very important that you don't place any kind of value on being different. Sensory experiences. I wish they realized that our sensory experiences are vastly different than yours. I wish they took my sensory pain seriously and not gaslight me by saying it's a small problem. The person at the bottom said, they allowed me to have downtime. They let me be in my room and never forced me to socialize. So one of the things that they really appreciated was the downtime and the space that their parents gave them to interact in the world at a pace that was comfortable for them. I'm not going to go through every quote because you should be able to access those on the slides, but they're all important. Encourage interests. Help them to develop their interests. For every person in this world, it is important to be good in something and to enjoy something with full passion. I'm going to read the second one because this is something that I think parents and educators do by accident. It's not intentional. We're trying to help kids develop sort of typical interests or age-appropriate interests. You might see a teenager really latching on to those stuffies that they had as a child and not wanting to let go. But what happens when we give kids those messages? Don't shame us out of our special interests. I was 13 and playing with toy horses. Setting up bar scenes was great fun. My mother came in and complained, "Don't you think you're too old for that?" I was so ashamed. I put the horses away and I never played with them again. I don't really remember how to play now. So everything that is actually said to these girls. They're so sensitive and they're so literal that this kind of comment can actually really alter their lives. So I'm not trying to scare you, but I just want you to be aware that we have to be very mindful of the types of language that we use when we're talking to autistic people. And about my body, I would have liked more direct, explicit, detailed advice and information about growing up stuff, like periods, sex, relationships. I didn't get enough info, and the info I did get wasn't frank enough. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later today. Two people really stressed actually how important it was that their parents took the time to find physical activities that fit with their needs. And this is incredibly meaningful. The second one here is actually a personal trainer and has gone on to really find that movement has been a big part of who she is and her identity. And the second one talked about dance. As we know, people on the spectrum can have coordination issues. They can have difficulties with following the rules if there's cooperative games. So finding individualized activities where they can really thrive is a great way for them to be active and build self-confidence. And lastly, school. I wish my parents would fight for better treatment in school. Many teachers don't understand the reasons behind the behaviors and the accommodations. Girls tend to be considered not autistic enough because they tend to mask better. It doesn't lessen their challenges, it just compounds them. A couple people talked about wishing that their parents had advocated more for them for accommodations and supports in school. One or two people said they wish they were homeschooled. School can be a terrorizing place for a child on the spectrum, especially from a social point of view, or even from an academic point of view, if the pace that they're moving at isn't the same as their neurotypical peers. It can also be a wonderful place of support, depending on the school environment. This one at the end here came from a woman that I'm working with. She finished high school, but she never went any further. And her parents didn't encourage her to go any further. And this is something that stuck with her until now, as we're working together. She felt so much shame that she never achieved her full intellectual potential. It's only now that she's starting to accept that it was because of the circumstances of her life and her autism that she couldn't pursue it at the time, but she's now gone on to grow in this area. Okay, what to expect today? I'm going to talk about the female autism profile, how it differs from boys and men. I'm going to review the INVEST approach. This is something that I've come up with. It's a therapeutic framework for working with girls and women. It stands for Identify Needs, Validate, Educate, Strengthen, and Thrive. And I'm going to do this through a lifespan perspective. So our third sort of workshop today, we're actually going to go all the way from childhood to old age and look at what happens throughout the lifespan for girls and women. Brief word on language. I don't know if some of you noticed, I've already been sort of dancing between different terms. So I said autistic, I said a person on the spectrum, I said a person with autism. I'm trying to mirror the language of the people that I work with and support. There's person-first language, like person with autism. And then there's identity-first language, autistic person. And there's been a real resurgence of the use of people calling themselves autistic in a way that shows pride. Right, that I am autistic and this is who I am and it can't be separated from my identity. Other people aren't comfortable with that. They are a person first and they have autism. So I'm going to use both in the presentation. I do not use the word disorder in my work. If you look at my website, it doesn't exist. I see it as a difference, not a disorder. People can think differently, but I practice from a neurodiversity framework. I see that people are wired differently and everybody has something different to offer. And if you look at people as being disordered, they're going to grow up thinking they're disordered, right? Here's a note. Oh, sorry, gender. Girl and women, we're not limited to sex. A lot of people who are born cis female end up becoming non-binary or trans. And I want to include all those people in our discussion today. So anyone who identifies as female, non-binary, or who was born female. And that little icon there, this means that we're doing a discussion or an exercise. So what I'm doing is I'm prompting you to tell you that there's a visual cue that's going to come up that'll say that during that time, we're going to do an exercise together. So I don't have to talk the whole time, right? So at times throughout the day, you're going to have to pair up or get into small groups or shout out answers. So I really appreciate your interaction today because it'll make it that much more meaningful. That goes for you too as well over the web. Talk to your cat or dog or your coworkers, and we're going to all get involved. So this is what we're going to talk about this morning before the break. As I mentioned, the female autism profile, why it gets missed and what gets identified instead. Late in life identification. And then I'm going to start, if there's time, I'll enter into the therapeutic approach that I developed called INVEST. And on a number of the first few slides, you're going to see some faces. All of these faces are of women who've been diagnosed later in life who are all autism advocates. So this is neurodivergent Rebel. We're actually going to hear from her later talking about shutdowns and meltdowns. But she's a great source of information if you want some firsthand accounts about autism. So who here is familiar with the DSM-5 autism? Okay, good. So I don't have to review it. What I do want to point out is that in 2013, when they did make the update, 2 things were added, which I've put in bold, which has opened up more opportunity for girls and women to be recognized. So one is that they're actually acknowledging there's sensory processing differences. And all the research shows that girls and women experience sensory differences at a much greater rate than males on the spectrum. So being able to add this to the DSM was very important. The second one was that symptoms, and I'm going to skip over a few words, may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capabilities or may be masked by learning strategies later in life. So this is why girls have missed all this time, because they've been masking their autism, or they're not getting caught in childhood because they can sort of function with the more simplistic play as children, but as they get older, when the social dynamics get more complex, that's when the traits of autism are coming out. But it's also at the time when people develop mental health issues. So a lot of time there's confusion between, is this mental health or is this developmental? And because it's developmental, but it's coming up at 12 and 13, they're not looking for autism. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is Amethyst Shaber. She's from BC, actually. I don't know if anyone knows her. She has a series on YouTube called Ask an Autistic. Great videos explaining what it's like to be on the spectrum and live on the spectrum. So what's the difference? I'm going to go through the different categories of the DSM and then apply to females instead of males. So for social communication, there's an awareness that being social for girls is valued and expected. And there's much less autistic behavior in social situations. I did a poll before you came in, and some people asked some questions about research in this area. So I want to highlight a few key people who are doing research in this area. Meng-Xuan Lai, Laura Hull, Will Mandy, who was here before, and Robin Stewart. And Robert is a researcher with autism, or an autistic researcher. And they're looking at how autism presents differently in girls and women, and we're getting much, much closer to being able to actually develop tools that can recognize autism in girls and women. There just came out, Laura Hull just put out a paper 2 weeks ago or last week on camouflage, and they've actually created a measure that is a questionnaire to ask autistic adults to what level do you camouflage. And it's a beautiful article, so look it up if you want, because actually the survey is embedded in the article. It's open access, so you can take a look at that. But what is camouflage, for those people who haven't heard it? This is the ability to study and imitate others. So I'll give you a few examples. This might be in person, face-to-face. Like a lot of young girls that I've worked with would choose one of the popular kids in school and really watch her and observe her, and then go home and in front of the mirror practice those behaviors and practice talking like her and really try to take on the persona of the popular girl, because the popular girl has friends. So if I act like the popular girl, I will have friends too. One teenager I worked with watched Mean Girls and became one of the mean girls, but that was really difficult for her because she's actually a very nice person. And she ended up hating herself because she was such a mean person. And it really created huge identity issues for her. But she was looking for an identity to hang on to because she knew that what she had to offer wasn't going to be acceptable to other people her age. It's about looking the part. And it's very exhausting. One woman that I work with, she's really high power, she's accomplished a lot. She's watched videos of all the world leaders and practiced their gesticulation and practiced how their hand gestures and practiced how they evoke emotion from people. And when she went first to get a public assessment, she was denied. They said, oh no, you're too resilient, you have too many gestures, you make good eye contact. And then she went for a private assessment for someone who understands women, and immediately it was a no-brainer, right? But what's happening is these girls and women are so good at social skills that they're working their way out of being recognized and assessed. So social skills continue to develop with age. We see autism traits emerging when the demands exceed the skills. Often they can do well one-on-one, but difficulty in groups. So they don't know if, with groups, when's it my turn? What should I say? So they just often sit quietly in groups, or they blurt things out, which isn't really welcomed by others. But they communicate really, really nicely in safe settings. So you'll see someone with autism maybe goes out in public and they shut down and they're very quiet, but take them to a space with people they feel really comfortable with, or animals they're really close to, and suddenly their personality really emerges. So we want to try to create environments like that and relationships like that with the people we work with. So there's a myth, right, that people on the spectrum are all introverted. Some are, for sure. They maybe have one or two close friends. But there's tons of females, especially who are more extroverted. They're loud and they're bubbly, but they're also clashing. So they're offending people and they don't realize it, and they're breaking rules and interfering in personal space. So we have to remember that autism looks different for everybody. This is Becca Laurie. She has a wonderful podcast called Spectrumly Speaking. So check it out if you're interested. She interviews different autism advocates, and she also was diagnosed later in life. So let's talk a bit about restricted and repetitive behaviors. And I don't like that term. I don't like what it's used for, but special interests for girls are very similar to their neurotypical peers, often really hard to tease out on the surface. They may love the same kind of cartoons or dolls or fan fiction, but if you really find out the level to which they love these things, it's like completely different. I mean, they know absolutely everything about absolutely everything that they can know about. They love information. Their stuffed animals are like family members. They're so close to them, they can never, ever part with them. So it's hard to separate what's a regular special interest and what's a special interest of a woman or girl on the spectrum. There's also a myth that people who have autism don't have imagination. As we know, that's not true at all. Girls escape into their imaginary worlds all the time. Some of them live there half the time at school, basically dissociating and not really being present. But they can have lots of imaginary friends up into an age that's much later than expected. Their behaviors are much more socially acceptable. So maybe instead of flapping and rocking and vocalizing, they're twirling their hair and they're picking at their nails and they're picking at their scabs and they're tensing their bodies, right? So they're doing things in very subtle ways that maybe people aren't picking up on. And then they've learned to internalize behaviors. So a lot of girls have gotten the message that the way that they interact with the world is wrong and needs to be changed. And so they instead, repetitive thoughts, a lot of perseveration, replaying events, thought loops, but they do well with structure, routine, and clear expectations. Sensory processing, as I mentioned, just came up in the DSM a number of years ago. I'm not going to go through each one. I think you guys are probably familiar with sensory processing, but I'm just going to bring up a couple. How many here saw Kelly Mahler speak on interoception or are familiar with the term interoception? Okay, a couple. So interoception is basically your brain's ability to register what's happening inside your body. So knowing if you feel hungry, if you have pain, if you're tired, if you are experiencing emotion. So this is all interoception. It's all being able to tune in what's happening in your body. And a lot of people on the spectrum are very disconnected from their bodies and not aware of what's happening inside. You'll see this in ways like someone maybe doesn't even know they're hurt until they look down and there's blood coming out of their arm. Or it's wintertime and they're wearing shorts because they don't even feel the temperature difference, right? The other one I wanted to just point out is that sensory processing difficulties makes the world a very, very scary and overwhelming place. Because you never know at what point in time a loud bus is going to zoom by, or a siren is going to go off, or someone's going to do the hand dryer. Like, beware of the hand dryers in the bathroom here, actually. They're terrible. So all of these things are really frightening if you don't know when you're going to have your next assault. And that's why people on the spectrum often tend to prefer to be in their routines or to be in familiar spaces where they know they're safe. Makes a lot of sense when you think about it from that point of view. So being in public is very draining and anxiety-provoking, even things like going to the grocery store, waiting rooms at a doctor's office, being on public transit, and downtime is needed for sensory deprivation, absolutely needed. Some people say an hour, for exposure, for an hour for downtime, not always realistic, but certainly we need to help these kids regulate. And this is a blogger from the States. This is Seeking Sarah. She wrote a blog about sort of the 5 things that she wished everyone knew about autism. It's good. It's clear. It's well written. So I recommend that. Some associated challenges for females with autism is emotional regulation difficulties. So we're seeing a lot of internalized struggles with anxiety, depression, high rates of eating disorders, self-harm, and substance abuse. I'm going to do a whole section on mental health in a few minutes, so we'll get to that. Alexithymia and theory of mind challenges. Who here knows alexithymia? Okay, we've got a couple people who are really well informed on some of these terms. Alexithymia, this is another big word for difficulty identifying what you're feeling and putting it into words to express it to others. And people with autism often have difficulties with alexithymia. And I'm going to talk later today about some strategies that can really help promote emotional expression. Because if you don't know what you're feeling, it's really hard to regulate it, right? Very easy to get overwhelmed. Another misnomer is that autistic people are not empathetic. That is completely false. From the autistic people I know, most of them are empaths. So what that means is they feel the emotions of everyone in the room. I mean, they feel intensely. What they're lacking is cognitive empathy. So they have affective empathy. They feel the emotion, but they can't sort out the emotion in their brain. What am I feeling and why? And that's where the overwhelm comes from. And that's why it's hard from a social point of view to always express empathy. But please, please, please note that people are very, very, very sensitive and that they're highly, highly attuned emotionally. And especially when given the opportunity, they can really be wonderful, nurturing individuals. And as a result of all these issues, there's struggles with identity and self-esteem.